Chain Reaction. Written by Joy McNeil. Read to you by Smilin Observer. It is every young boy's dream to become a firefighter. Well, that was what Franco Castillo thought. At elementary school, he spent most of his time during recess straddling the top bars of the jungle gym or climbing the rope ladders. Now, as he hung suspended from a harness making his way down the Skyway Bridge, his thoughts returned to the past. He remembered the day at school when Sandra Lopez had got her legs entangled between two rungs of the climbing frame. He had managed to keep calm and help the frightened girl escape unharmed. Refocusing back to the task at hand, Franco swept his hand across his forehead to push his fringe back under the rim of his helmet. He then looked down at the limp body of the woman dressed in a gray coat and jeans. She lay motionless, just above the concrete pillar, hanging upside down by one leg, which was hooked on the metal strut of the bridge. This was the only thing that stopped her from plummeting into the icy water of the Calumet River. A chilly, cold winter wind stung at Franco's cheeks as he was lowered past the shelter of the main bridge and into the open space below. "Are you all right down there, Franco?" one of the rescue squad team called from above. From where the victim lay pinned, it was impossible for the crew to see how close he was to her. In fact, if it hadn't been for the red convertible that lay abandoned on the bridge above, a passing cabbie would not have looked over at the young woman as she stood perched on the edge of the railing. He slammed on his brakes and ran over to her, hoping to stop her from leaping off the side. Nobody would have known she was there at all if he had not witnessed her jump. When the Chicago Fire Department arrived, they knew she had not fallen into the river. For one, the cabbie hadn't heard a splash. And secondly, there was no sign of broken ice on the frozen layer that covers the river where she had jumped off. The only other explanation was that she had been tangled somehow on the bridge below them. "Another 3 feet," Franco yelled back up to the other squaddies. He felt the rope moving again, and finally he managed to reach their victim. Gently he pulled the top half of her limp body upright. He yanked the thick glove free from his hand so he could feel for a pulse on the young woman's neck. She was still alive, but unresponsive. Franco securely positioned a harness around her, and he carefully unhooked her badly fractured leg from the strut. Once she was free and everything was secured, he yelled up to the squad to winch them back up. 5 minutes later, Franco helped place their patient into the cot, and he watched as she was loaded into the back of the ambulance. He couldn't help thinking that she was one of the lucky ones. Most people wanting to end their lives by jumping off the Skyway Bridge were successful in achieving the end result they desired. If the fall hadn't initially killed them, the icy cold river had. A guardian angel must have been looking after this attractive redhead, who only looked to be in her early 20s. Franco couldn't help wondering what had sent her off the deep end. It certainly would not have been for a lack of money, because she was driving a late model BMW. "Right, let's get out of here," the captain called out to his crew after they had finished packing up the gear. Back at the station, one of the crew grilled steaks, while Franco and one of the other firefighters cooked up some risotto and vegetables. You weren't cooking up sprouts again, are you, Franco? One of the young rookies asked as he walked in and looking over at the pots boiling on the stove. If I am, you better friggin' eat them, Franco replied, grinning from ear to ear. The crew were like a family to him, and the rookie was just like having a kid brother. The steak smelled so good to Franco. He was looking forward to chowing down on his dinner. He still felt cold from the time he had spent hanging over the side of the bridge, and the hot meal was a welcoming sight. Sadly, that wasn't going to happen. The minute he took up his knife and fork to cut through the juicy fat piece of steak, the tones rang out, and the dispatcher informed them that they were to respond to a structure fire in an apartment complex a few blocks from the station. One of these days I'm going to rip the wires from that darn thing, he stated loudly as he scraped his chair back forcefully and followed the rest of the crew to the squad. He knew by the time he got back to the steak, it would be tough as leather boots. I'll remind you of that if we ever have a quiet shift, Franco, Rosa answered as they threw on their turnout gear. At least you got to hang out with a pretty girl on our last call. Such a comedian, Rosa. There's no such thing as a quiet shift at this station. And the next guy we need to recover, you can hang out with him instead, he replied as they jumped into the squad. Rosa and Franco had known each other for years. She was the girlfriend of his best buddy Brad, who served for the Chicago Police Department. At least once a week they would all meet up at the corner bar for drinks and a wind-down session. Franco didn't have a girlfriend himself. There was one girl he liked, but he hadn't gotten around to asking her out. When the squad pulled up to the scene of the fire, the penthouse suite of the luxury apartment was fully involved, and there were a number of folks standing around outside in various stages of undress. Some people had been woken from their sleep and stood there shivering in their pajamas. It was quickly established that everyone from the complex was accounted for, apart from the young couple who lived in the penthouse suite. I don't know if they're in the building. Their car isn't parked outside, an elderly lieutenant said, as he stood there answering to the captain's questions. A member of the EMS crew brought over a blanket and put it around the old man's shoulders. Okay, thank you, sir, the captain replied as he waited for the rescue team. Once they had all their gear ready, Franco, Rosa, and the other squaddies came around from the back of the squad to check in with him before heading out. We possibly have 2 victims on the top floor apartment, the captain told them sternly. Franco, who was the leader of the first trio, acknowledged the captain. They quickly made their way around the pluggy, who was fixing the hose coupling to the hydrant as they headed towards the burning building. Once inside, the firefighters split into 2 groups. Their vision was clear on the lower floors, but as they made their way to the top floor, towards the penthouse, the thick smoke encircled them, like that of a plane heading into a cover of a storm. Franco held the thermal imaging camera up to check for hot spots, while they felt their way carefully along the wall of the stairwell. Suddenly, Franco almost stumbled forward when his foot hit a large, solid object that lay across the stairs. He hadn't seen it as he was holding the camera upwards to check the ceiling above him. He shined his flashlight towards the man who must have been trying to escape the fire before being overcome by the toxic smoke. Rosa called in their find. Rescue 1 located 1 male victim. while Franco grabbed around the knees of the limp body as he dragged their victim backwards down the stairs. When the firefighters got into clean air, Franco placed their victim in the fireman's hold so that they could move him quickly down the rest of the stairs and out of the building. He laid the man on the grass verge as he ripped off his mask and helmet. Both items hit the ground with a resounding thud as he started assessing their patient. The man, who looked to be in his late 20s, was dressed in only a towel. He was not breathing, and there was no sign of a pulse. Franco started chest compressions while the EMS crew positioned their gear around the patient. They worked on him for 20 minutes, trying to get a cardiac output. But sadly, no matter what they did, the man wasn't coming back. By the time they had finished trying to revive their patient, there was no need for Franco to return to the complex. The fire was almost out, and after a complete search of the premises by the other squaddies who had arrived on scene, there had been no sign of the woman who lived in the penthouse suite. The only hope of establishing if she had succumbed to the fire was now a job for the forensic team. Once everything was packed up, the squad followed behind the ladder as they made their way back to the main street. But just as the ladder turned on a green light, a car shot across the road at a high rate of speed and smashed into the side of the truck with an almighty crunch. Franco couldn't believe his eyes as the driver of the squad slammed on the brakes and came to a sudden halt 6 inches from the ladder's bumper. What in the world? The driver swore as he turned on the beacons, and everyone else jumped out of the squad to grab their gear. The ladder crew were all fine, but the same could not be said for the driver of the car. She lay motionless, with her face over the steering wheel, as the car horn blared out loudly from the weight of her head upon it. Franco was the first to reach the sole driver. Thankfully, the door was undamaged, and he managed to open it and carefully move the patient back to an upright position while maintaining her C-spine and an open airway. The airbags had been deployed, but she was not wearing a seatbelt, and with the force of the crash, she had been propelled forward and knocked unconscious. EMS showed up within minutes of the emergency call going out. They placed a collar on the patient and started to assess her for injuries. Once she was stabilized onto a backboard, the squaddies moved her from her car, and she was placed into the ambulance. And EMS pulled away from the scene. Franco looked down at his watch. His shift was at an end. He could feel his stomach growling angrily to be fed. He decided he had finished work. He would head for the all-night cafe and order himself an extra large portion of steak and fries. On the return journey to the station, Rosa sat quietly in the backseat of the squad next to Franco, flicking through the text messages on her phone. It looks like Brad is having a terrible shift as well. He didn't have the chance to eat his dinner either, she commented as she scrolled down the screen. I'm planning on heading to the cafe once we're done. Do you both want to join me? Franco replied. Sounds good. I'll text Brad and have him meet us there in half an hour. The cafe was practically empty when they arrived. The only other patron was a local bum who who sat at a corner table, slowly fingering through his loose change. Before he placed his order with the waitress, who stood there patiently waiting for him to make up his mind. When she was done serving him, the waitress came over to their table and smiled sweetly down at Franco. He had known Sissy for a while now and had even considered asking her out, although he didn't quite worked up the courage to do so. Facing the dangers of his full-time job seemed less daunting to him than asking out the pretty blonde with a smile that could melt an iceberg. They placed their orders with her, and once they had all had their drinks in hand, Brad moved his head closer to the other two, so he couldn't be overheard by the others in the cafe. He had an interesting story to tell them about a chain reaction in the events which had resulted in their last 3 calls that night. Franco, you might find this hard to believe, but the girl you retrieved from the side of the Skyway Bridge was responsible for your next 2 jobs as well. How so? Franco replied with a puzzled look on his face. She is the wife of the fatality from the complex fire, and he was having an affair with the woman who crashed into the ladder truck. The 2 squaddies looked at each other in total disbelief. Well, I'm relieved she wasn't in the apartment, but how could she have been involved in the crash? Franco couldn't help asking. My partner and I went to see the wife at the hospital and gave her the bad news about her husband. She then broke down and came clean with information about the other events that occurred during the night. It turns out she was cooking dinner. Her husband came home from work and told her he was leaving her for her blonde at the office. They got into a huge argument, after which time he said he was going to take a shower and go to bed. She stormed out of the apartment, leaving the pot boiling on the stovetop. She then drove to the apartment of her husband's lover. She had planned on confronting the other woman about the affair, but instead she decided to cut the brake cable on her car in the hope of giving the blonde a fright. On the wife's way back home, when she got to the Skyway Bridge, she snapped. And of course, you know the rest. Wow, I don't believe it, Franco exclaimed, shaking his head slowly. If you ever did anything like that to me, Bradley Martin, you'd be toast as well, Rosa said to her boyfriend with a huge grin on her face. The victim's wife hadn't planned on the fire happening, Rosa. That was an accident, which she made very clear to us. And you know darn well I'd never do that to you anyway. It wouldn't be worth my life, given your family connections to the mafia. Rosa was about to hit him with the menu list. However, just then, the attractive waitress showed up at the table with their meals. Thanks, Sissy, Franco said, as she placed a large plate of food in front of him. Hey, I was wondering, would you like to go see a movie with me Friday? She smiled at him sweetly and nodded her head in confirmation before walking off with a sassy swing in her stride. You finally had the guts to ask her out, Brad said with a big grin. Yeah, well, I figured after the shift we just had, she would be a nice distraction. You just never know what the day will bring. You just never know what day will be your last. The